You're not someone here, but were you able to get him on the phone, or does he want to answer? Okay. If we can bring him in to answer questions, we will, but he sent a video in place of coming online with us. Mike Golden, he did a very interesting recent article about Gerald Posner. Guy doesn't do much computer work.
Sometime in the next 50 years, probably right before the National Archives are officially due to be opened, the marketing clowns of some blindly ambitious multinational conglomerate will realize they've exhausted their normal strategy of putting out a new pud puller every time they make a minute change in the pud puller of record there's peddling as the most essential lifestyle tools. It's the last most essential pud puller they were peddling 6 months earlier to the almost obsolete rubes still out there consuming their empty lives away. Which is when the marketing clowns will come up with a bright idea of selling content. Remember content? If you don't, you're not alone, since we all know content, even though it does feel emptiness, begins to suck real fast in a world so fragmented, attention deficit disorder is the permanent condition people's condition is in. Short bite even shorter, the marketing mavens realize they can't just sell any old content this time around. This time around, the content has to be special. And this special content will be packaged for a gigantic special holiday special that they'll hype for at least 2, 3, maybe even 5 years before whoever the Spielberg or Cameron of the day comes out with this stupendous, full-length, special government-sanctioned animated 3D musical called The 3 Assassinations. The 3 Assassinations, or 3A in 3D, as the hipper pundits will call it, will be more like an opera than a Broadway musical, though it will open on Broadway at the same time it opens on the big screen and on pay-per-view for the lifestyle shut-ins. This special will depict the 3 major popular inspirational political leaders of the 1960s, JFK, MLK, and RFK, as traitors to America who had to be eliminated in order to save the country. The assassins, of course, will be portrayed as the good guys, brave, faceless FBI and CIA agents, aided by wily mob warriors looking to redeem their heinous lifestyles in order to protect truth, beauty, and the American way from something. Maybe the Red Menace. If the ubiquitous they can get that lame MacGuffin to come back from the dead and fly into the face of the 2 trillion-pound unfettered capitalist snowball from hell of technological progress rolling down the mountain over the out-of-control lives of gluttonous 21st century consumers, maybe it's even something we've never heard of before. Because like the millions of aliens from different planets and galaxies some people believe are living amongst us on planet Earth, it, like them, couldn't officially exist in the middle of the 21st century, except in the paranoia of the collective refried unconscious. If and when the time actually comes to open the National Archives, the mood-regulated people of the 21st century probably won't want to make a big thing about it. In fact, they'll probably be satisfied as long as the authorities make an obligatory public show of not just giving the project outright to any one company, just to show they're fair. As we all know, no matter how out of whack things get here, if the gestalt doesn't reek of fair, no matter how it's marketed, how it's boogered, or what spin Satan Schlockmeisters put on it, it won't fly in the land of the mortgaged and the home of the fragged. So one way or another, the ruling mediocrity of that time period will have to conduct open bidding on the 3 assassinations among the 5, 4, 3, 2 major media conglomerates left on the planet. Obviously, it's hard to picture. Even harder to buy the concept of open bids because deep down, we all know who better to tell the story, who better to spin the history of our darkest days than the folks who gave us Pinocchio and the 7 Dwarves. As any politician worth the salt of his hypocrisy-covered Peter might say, when evoking the hot button of selling the cliche of saving our children's future, it's not only in our children's national interest that Mickey Mouse tell the story. At the rate things are going down here on Planet Mall, by the time the archives are finally open, it may be the best interest of business as usual to target market this conspiracy spectacle to the lowest common denominator of the old marketplace. After all, How many times do we have to hear the business of business is business before we realize business is the engine of this great out-of-control society? And any company who can sell Mickey Mouse, Goofy, and Donald Duck ought to be able to sell Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, and Sirhan Sirhan as heroes, right? And if not, maybe the Warner Brothers remove Mount Rushmore down to Orlando and put their heads up on a new competing Mount Turner across the street along with Bugs, Daffy, Tweety, and Elmer Fudd showing their wares down on us. Obviously, by the time the archives are finally opened, it will take a pretty grandiose spin to convince anybody who isn't totally brain dead that elements of the government in cahoots with the military-industrial infotainment complex and the mob did not kill Jack Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Bobby Kennedy too. So why deny the obvious when it's so much easier to go with the flow and soft-sell the conspiracy the way it really went down? Is there anybody out there who cares what they're hiding and why they're hiding it anymore? By this point, I think not. When most people look at the state of the world today, all they can think about is the threat of losing their jobs during the economic crisis, losing their security in homes in the middle of a Wall Street manipulated banking and housing scams, losing their so-called freedom from terrorist attacks on our way of life. I could go on, laying out dozens of things that people are rightfully worried about today that are much more important to them than the 3 political assassinations that took place in this country over 40 years ago. Yet what has to be realized is that the specter of those 3 assassinations looms as large, if not as hysterical, today as they did right after they happened. Back during the long, drawn-out election process of 2008, most of us, no matter which side of the coin we were situated on, silently believed that if elected, Obama would be assassinated before he was actually sworn in. The reality of that unpleasant possibility certainly must have crossed his mind as well, because we're all conditioned in this country to know deep down that if we're not vigilant, it not only could happen again, it will happen again. We know from experience it could happen tomorrow to a president, and they'll pick a patsy and get away with it. We know from experience it could happen tomorrow to a great moral leader operating outside the corruption of politics, and they'll pick a patsy and get away with it. We know it could happen tomorrow to whoever that all-controlling they feels is blocking the flow of money they believe by the arrogant grossness of divine right is theirs. And if that thought alone is not reason enough to stand up for the truth and bring closure to these 3 political assassinations, try very simply admitting you love this country and care that it lives up to its founding fathers' drunk with hubris promise. You care that America sheds its by now taken for granted hypocrisy and quits operating out in the world like most people are too deaf, dumb, and blind to see the greatest country in the history of this planet is well on the way to becoming, if it hasn't already become, its own antithesis. Unfortunately, the only way that fate can be changed before it permanently embeds itself into constitutional interpretation as dumbass and self-serving as shameless evangelical hustling is if those of us who do see through the corruption of the most respected institutions supposedly watchdogging our so-called freedoms have the courage to call them out on the carpet every time we catch one of their shills in the act of subverting the truth. That overblown lead-in brings me to the case of the not-so-honorable Gerald Posner. Brings me to asking the question whether it's enough to call out the Gerald Posners of the world without calling out the institutions they're shilling for under the banner of a free press. While you ponder the question and look over the article Assassination by Omission, which can be found on both COPA and Exile Online's websites, I'll briefly summarize Posner's fall from mainstream privilege and protection. It all started when Posner was caught plagiarizing all over his latest book, Miami Babylon, a scandal-babble history of how Miami came to be. As a result, Tina Brown, one of Posner's 2 major champions, had no choice but to let her #1 investigative pet at the Daily Beast go. A few days later, Posner hired his one-time ideological enemy in the old assassination conspiracy debate, 83-year-old Mark Rush to Judgment Lane, to file a complaint against Miami New Times to stop the Alternative Weekly from publishing further example of Posner's plagiarism. Enough actually to argue that Posner's career has been practically built on regularly stealing other people's work. Posner getting caught and discredited has long been expected by those covering the counterintelligence field, but not for something as minor as plagiarism. As the mainstream media's most preeminent proponent of the JFK-MLK lone gunman assassination theory, Posner's major identifiable affront to unbiased reporting has been the invisible crime of omission, a methodology more heinous in the long run than even flat-out stealing or lying. In other words, you wouldn't know what omissions exist if you didn't know the information being left out existed in the first place. Which is why most of the readers of Posner's 1998 best-selling Killing the Dream didn't notice the subterfuge in his deliberately one-sided analysis of the MLK assassination, which attempts to eliminate any doubt that James Earl Ray was the lone gunman assassin without presenting the other side of the equation as anything but hackneyed. Whether Ray was or wasn't the shooter, the clearest example of Posner's dishonesty in this book was the complete erasing from history of the existence of Frank Holloman, the Memphis police chief and fire director at the time of the King assassination. Holloman retired from the FBI after having spent 25 years in the Bureau. From 1949 to 1959, his primary responsibility was managing the Washington Bureau Office for Shea Hoover. So he was not just any ex-FBI agent, he came out of the inner circle. His specific duties there are a huge can of worms still waiting to be opened. But when he officially retired from the Bureau in 1964, he moved to the Bluff City to become Director of Development for Memphis State University and then Executive Director of the Mid-South Medical Center. Mayor Henry Loeb appointed Holloman to be the first person ever to head both the police and fire departments at the same time, just in time to provide support for Loeb's irrationally stubborn opposition to the sanitation workers' strike by laying down the hardline law of the land to the sanitation workers group attempting to negotiate with the mayor against the inhuman conditions of their job, conditions so blatantly oppressive there couldn't have been a more magnetic setup to lure Dr. King to meet his fate on April 4th, 1968 at the Lorraine Motel. That Posner did not bother to mention the natural suspicion that a former FBI honcho like Chief Holloman might have had anything to do with all those orders given to all those supervisors under him, who in turn gave all those orders to all those employees under them to, namely, remove Dr. King's black police bodyguards and to have the Parks Department cut down the thick, high brush in the backyard of the rooming house at 7 a.m. the morning directly after the assassination, before the terrain could be examined for evidence, is enough, any way you look at it, to re-examine the entire case. Even if a brilliant argument could be made that Holloman could not have had anything to do with what happened in Memphis that dark day, the need to make such an argument would have had to confront the possibility of a totally different picture of what might have, could have, most likely happened, that would warrant serious consideration before any conclusion of what actually did happen could be reached if the prosecution had even bothered to note Holloman existed. Obviously, the pathetic state of mainstream American journalism over the last decade has degenerated into little more than a jumping on the bandwagon business. A little over a week after Posner threatened the Miami Alternative Weekly with lawsuits to stop them from exposing his nasty little habit further, they called his bluff by revealing that a 48-year-old Wisconsin doctoral student had discovered that Posner had lifted 35 passages in 2 books, Why America Slept, his 2003 take on the 9/11 attacks, and Secrets of the Kingdom, a 2005 book about Saudi Arabia. To prove the converse of the no good deed goes unpunished credo, 8 days later, Posner was rewarded, or paid off as the case may be, for his now long gone career when the sullied Miami Babylon was optioned by LA-based producer Kerry Woods with the intent of turning it into a tropical version of The Wire for Showtime. The legacy of Posner's shillism, there's just no way to call it journalism any longer, is that his bogus narrative of what happened in the MLK case has become the traditional hack standard of what the mainstream media will allow to be considered what really happened in Memphis, April 4th, 1968. The latest and most recent substandard white bread tome to embrace this tradition is Hamptonside's Hellbound on His Trail, which, like Posner's fabrication, became a pure recounting of Assistant District Attorney General John Campbell's fictional narrative, the same narrative Posner embraced of what could have happened, as long as all those holes of omission like the existence of Holloman remained hidden from the audience. I encountered Sides in late April at a Center for Communication screening of Roads to Memphis, an American Experience PBS docudrama that was produced to be released parallel to the publication of his book. The 2 authorities using the film to explain to the audience what really happened in Memphis were Posner and John Campbell. I had no choice but to stand up in the Q&A session after the screening and call sides out for blatantly misrepresenting not only what could have happened in Memphis, but what did happen. Unbelievably, the defense he blurted out when called on his misrepresentations was, "I wanted to write a book about the assassination, not about the conspiracy."
I think so. Yeah. He also in the article notes that when Posner was confronted directly at the lecture by one of the people that he had plagiarized from, my apologies to the ladies in the audience, he said, "So I'm a thieving cocksucker." Explanation enough, I guess. Yeah, and you know, he admits it. But the other thing he mentioned in the article, which is even more telling to me, is that Posner was recently hired as a public relations agent in the United States for the two brothers of President Karzai in Afghanistan. One of those brothers having been having a long-term relationship not only with the Central Intelligence Agency, but with most of the opium sales in Afghanistan. And that's who Posner is representing now here, while he's being defended by, you know, our old friend Mark Lane. And his public statement about hiring Lane was, if you can imagine this twist of logic, he said, "Well, I hired Mark Lane because even though he and I disagree, you know, about Oswald's guilt in the Kennedy assassination, he's the one lawyer in the country who could have gotten Oswald off, so that, you know, and by implication, even though he did it, therefore I hired him to help me."
Let me know when you're done.
Yeah, well, I mean,
does he have a regular? Didn't he have a little article, a daily article, a weekly article in the New York Times or something for a while?
who are you talking about, Golden or Posner?
Posner, wasn't he a columnist?
I don't know, the New York Times, but I mean, he's been a regular contributor to this Daily Beast publication online.
For some time, there was a monthly discussion session at UTA headed up by Joan Barge. And I attended that. There was a man who showed up there who said that he was in the process of writing a book. He was kind of vague about what he was up to. And we asked his name, Gerald Posner. There is a tape of that exists. It was made by a man who attended those sessions, who drove in from Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
And understand he has now moved to Waco.
Well, there's a chance that the plagiarism he put in the books has maybe a minimal amount of accuracy to it. The rest of his work is so abysmal. I mean, and we now know that he claimed to interview people and say what they said who never met him, you know, and he says he has tapes that he can't produce or won't produce, and you know, it's just the guy's completely a shill and a hack, like Lawrence Schiller, who helped the investigation into the scavengers and critics of the Warren Commission with Warren Lewis, and who aided Miller in his Oswald's Ghost nonsense, and also I think Executioner's Song, who was the only person allowed in to see some of the SLA members, and you know, these journalists that get special privileges and then tell the false story. So they're these hacks. It's Golden online. Okay.
What about
I
Max?
guess we can get some questions from
What
him.
about Max Holland?
He's on speaker now.
We did. What about Max Holland? You can read Max Holland on the homepage of the CIA. Just a minute. Hi, Mike.
Hey, John. How are you?
Okay, great. I'm glad you can take some questions. We enjoyed your presentation, and I tried to fill in some of the other stuff you said about Karzai, but maybe you could elaborate on that. And you know.
Well, it's more on the article. I mean, it's probably changed quite a bit too. It's just that Posner is representing Karzai's two brothers, probably more as a PR agent than a lawyer. Though, from what I understand, he was looking for American media outlets to sue for, you know, or probably bluffing the suit to get. To keep them from being slandered, or, you know, unquote, slandered. But basically, I don't know. It's you know, it's an ongoing thing.
Okay. Is any sound coming to the back from this? Okay.
I hear it.
Okay.
Yeah, we're okay.
Okay. Any other questions for him? Hold on a second. Anybody have a question?
Can anybody tell me what the background was of Posner before he began the JFK research?
Did you know anything about Posner's background before he began the JFK research?
Well, I think he was a Wall Street lawyer, from what I understand, who wrote a book on was it Mengels? It was something to do with the Nazis, and then he was recruited by Random House to write Case Closed. I don't think it was his idea to begin with, but that's the whole mystery of the inside of Random House. So they came to him, from what I understand. Now, I don't know whether that's factual or not, but that's the word.
Do you happen to know who the publisher was at Random House?
Random House.
No, but I meant his actual book dealer there. I mean, you know, the person he worked with.
Oh, Bob Loomis.
Who's Bob Loomis?
Well, Bob Loomis was also the one.
MLK.
Yes, and he also was the one that worked with Schiller and Mailer on the Oswald's Ghost, and he has ties with the intelligence agencies.
Yeah, that's what it appears.
Another question, just a sec.
Could you comment on Posner's book and hit job on Ross Perot, 1996? You know, Perot, of course, being a political enemy of the Bush family at that time.
A question about a hit job book that he did on Ross Perot at the time that he was running against the Bushes.
What did Posner do?
The guy said he wrote a book attacking Ross Perot. Do you know anything about it?
No, but I don't believe Posner writes any political books without being told what to write. You know, what they want.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, I don't think he comes up with his own ideas, from what I understand. But maybe he does. I mean, no, I don't know anything about that. He's not one of my favorite authors, so I don't go out of my way to read him.
Yeah. He did write a book about the death of Mengele, which was also disinformation. And prior to that, he wrote a book about bioterrorism.
Right. So, I mean, it's like he's somebody in a pool that they go to write books that about, a subject that I'm sure they want written.
Right?
Do you know anything about Posner's law partner as far as his connection to U.S. intelligence?
Do you know anything about Posner's law partner in regard to his connections to intelligence?
No, I mean, his law partner. The first I heard after I wrote this article, I was writing this article, that he had gone back to being a lawyer, and that must have happened after the whole plagiarism thing happened. So I don't know who his partner is, or whether he even has a partner.
I've spoken to him.
He's saying he's spoken to him. This is a law partner he had before that period.
At least since.
He has.
Hold on.
At least since 2005.
Had. Since
If
2005.
not earlier.
Do you know the name of the person?
I can't recall
Oh,
offhand.
okay. Well, I don't think he's aware of him either. Anybody else?
I don't follow Posner's career. It's just when it gets into the MLK.
You're forgiven for that.
Fair enough.
All right.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
All right. Well, let me. Somebody else has a question in the back.
Is your guy aware that Harold Weisberg allowed Posner to view his files, and in Harold Weisberg's unpublished manuscript, which is now out in the Hood College stuff, Jerry McKnight's release, is Harold's statements that when Posner disappeared from the scene with his students, files were missing, including the files, the Eldon Rudd files, which talking about the audio tapes and stuff like that. Original material that Harold got after great difficulty, battling in the courts, disappeared, coincidentally.
The question has to do with, are you aware that Posner went into the private collections of early critic and researcher Harold Weisberg, and that when he left, Weisberg discovered that materials that he had sued for, I guess under freedom of information, and critical ones, were missing from his collection?
I'm not aware of it, but I'm not surprised either. You know, there are two Posner articles that everyone should be aware of, and they can Google them. And they were 12 years ago, right before the Memphis trial, maybe 9 months before the Memphis trial. He was attacking it, and there are a lot of falsehoods in it, and it was in either the New York Times, I think it was in the New York Times, and then he wrote the only article that the Times published, that was not news, that a lot of places covered on the trial after it happened without knowing a single thing that happened in the trial, since he wasn't there, and it got no coverage other than one day on court TV, just one day. And so they're just, it's filled with false information, and it's all you have to do is Google it.
Okay, well, I'll let the audience tell you what they thought of your presentation. Thanks for being with us, Mike.
All right, thank you, John.
Take care.